Chapter 7. Know your environment from the inside out. Connection. Most people think first of what they want to express or make, then find an audience for their idea. You must work the opposite angle, thinking first of the public. You need to keep your focus on their changing needs, the trends that are washing through them. Beginning with their demand, you create the appropriate supply. Do not be afraid of people's criticisms. Without such feedback, your work will be too personal and delusional. You must work to maintain you must maintain as close a relationship to your environment as possible, getting an inside feel for what is happening around you. Never lose touch with your base. Hood economics. Here's a quote by Malcolm X. I knew that the ghetto people knew that I never left the ghetto in spirit, and I never left it physically any more than I had to. I had a ghetto instinct. For instance, I can feel if tension was beyond normal in a ghetto audience, and I can speak and understand the ghetto's language. Starting out as a drug dealer at the age of 12, Curtis Jackson faced an unfamiliar world that contained all kinds of dangers. The business side of hustling was relatively easy to figure out. It was the people, the various actors in the game, the rival hustlers, the big-time dealers, the police who could be tricky. The strangest and most impenetrable of all was the world of the drug users themselves, the clientele upon which his business depended. Their behavior could be erratic and even downright frightening. With rival hustlers and the police, Curtis could get inside their way of thinking because they all operated with a degree of rationality. But the drug fiends seemed to be dominated by their needs, and they could turn unfriendly or violent at any moment. Many dealers developed a kind of phobia of the fiends. They saw in them the weakness and dependence that could befall anyone who succumbed to addiction. The hustler relies on his razor-sharp mind. To even flirt with drug use could destroy such power and lead him down a slippery slope towards dependence. If he was around the fiends too much, he could become a user himself. Curtis understood this and he kept his distance from them. But this aspect of hustling bothered him. On one particular occasion, the fiends were suddenly avoiding him and he could not figure out why. All he knew was that he could not sell a batch of drugs that he had on consignment. Under such an arrangement, a higher-up source or connect had given him drugs for free. Once he sold the entire lot, he would return the specified amount of the earnings to the connect and keep the rest as profit. But in this instance, it looked like he would not make nearly enough to pay back the connect. That can prove damaging to his reputation and lead to all kinds of trouble. He might have to steal to get the money. Feeling somewhat desperate, he went into full hustling mode, working night and day, offering all kinds of discounts, whatever it took to unload the drugs. He managed to make back just enough, but it was a close call. Perhaps the quality of the batch he was selling was inferior, but how could he tell beforehand, and how he could prevent this from happening again and again? One day, he sought the advice of a man named Dre, an older hustler who had lasted an unusually long time dealing drugs on the streets. He was considered a sharp businessman. In prison, he studied economics on his own, and he seemed to have an especially good rapport with the fiends. Dre explained to Curtis that, in his experience, there are two kinds of hustlers in this world: those who stay on the outside and those who move to the inside. The outside types never bother to learn anything about their customers. It's just about money and numbers. They have no concept of psychology or the nuances of people's needs and demands. They're afraid of getting too close to the customer. That might force them to reassess their ideas and methods. The superior hustler moves to the inside. He is not afraid of the fiends. He wants to find out what's going on in their heads. Drug users are no different from anyone else. They have phobias and bouts of boredom and a whole inner life. Because you remain on the outside, he told Curtis, you don't see any of this, and your hustling is purely mechanical and dead. To raise your game, he explained, you have to first put into practice one of the oldest hustling tricks in a book, the tester. What this means is the following. Whenever you get a batch of drugs, you separate a portion to give out for free to the fiends, to certain fiends. They tell you right there on the spot whether the stuff is good or bad. If their feedback is positive, they will spread word through their own networks, and such reports are so much more credible coming from a fellow user than reports from a hustler hyping up his own stuff. And basically, like something similar to this that I can think of from reading that example is like at the food court at the mall. You know how when you go through the food court and you see the staff there standing there with free samples, handing it to people so they can taste it in real time and see, and they can get a feel of, what food item is going to sell the most? Well, that's pretty much like, the same example. Just throwing that out there. So welcome Travis, welcome Kevin Bailey. Who else is on this live with me? Welcome Pina, welcome Melissa Hayes. Welcome Rachel Johnson, Ibrahim. What's up, what's up, what's up? Well, shout out to my dad, Lorenzo. Welcome Heather, welcome, 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 you beautiful people. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you guys for coming on today. So, where was I? That's right. If the feedback is negative, you will have to adjust and find some way to cut it to offer illusions. A parent 2-for-1 deals with the capsule simply loaded with dust, whatever it takes to unload it. But you must always operate with feedback on the quality of your product. Otherwise, you will not survive on these streets. Once you have this system in place, you use it to cultivate relationships with your most relatable fiends. They supply you with valuable information about the kind of change in taste that are happening. Talking to them, you get all kinds of ideas for marketing schemes and new angles for hustling. You gain a feel for how they think. From this inside position, the whole game explodes into something creative and alive with the possibility. Curtis quickly incorporated this system and soon discovered that the drug fiends were not all as he imagined. They became erratic only when you were not consistent in your dealings with them. They valued convenience and fast transactions, wanted something new every now and again, and loved the thought of any kind of deal. With this growing body of knowledge, he can play to their needs and manipulate their demand. He discovered something else. Spending much of their time on the streets, they were a great source of information about what was going on with the police or the weaknesses of rival hustlers. Knowing so much about the neighborhood gave him a feeling of great power. Later, he would translate this same strategy to music in his mixtape campaign on the streets of New York. Maintaining in close connection to the taste of his fans, he would alter his music to their responses and create the kind of sound that had a visceral appeal, something that they had never heard before. After the remarkable success of his first 2 commercial albums, Curtis, now known as 50 Cent, stood at the top of the music world, but his sense of connection, so vital to the streets, was fading in a new environment he now inhabited. He was surrounded by flatterers who wanted to be in his entourage and managers and industry people who saw in him only dollar signs. His main interactions were with people in the corporate world or other stars. He could no longer hang out on the streets or get first-hand looks at the trends that were just starting up. All of this meant that he was flying blind with his music, not really sure if it would connect anymore with his audience. They were the source of his energy, spirit, but the distance separating them was growing. Other stars seemed to not mind this. In fact, they enjoyed this living in this kind of celebrity bubble. They were afraid of coming back down to earth. 50 felt the opposite, but there seemed to be no way out. And then in early 2007, he decided to start up his own website. He thought of it as a way to market his music and merchandise directly to the public without the screen of his record label, which proved quite inept in adapting to the internet age. Soon this website transformed itself into a social networking site like Facebook for his fans, and the more he delved into it, the more he began to sense that this represented much more than a marketing gimmick. It was perhaps the ultimate tool for reconnecting with his audience. First, he decided to experiment. As he prepared to launch a G-Unit record in the summer of 2008, he leaked one of the songs on the website on a Friday night, Then the next day he refreshed the comments page every few minutes and tracked the members' responses to it. After several hundred comments, it was clear that the verdict was negative. The song was too soft. They judged. They wanted and expected something harder from a G-Unit record. Taking their criticism to heart, he shelved the song and soon released another, creating the hard sound that they demanded. This time, the response was overwhelmingly positive. This called for more experiments. He put up the latest single from his archenemy, The Game, hoping to gain negative comments from his fans. To his surprise, many of them liked the song. He engaged in an online debate with them and had his eyes open about the changes in people's tastes and why they might have grown distant from his music. It forced him to rethink his own direction. To draw more people to his site, he decided to break down the distance in both directions. He posted blogs on personal subjects and then responded to his fans' comments. They could feel that they had complete access to him. Using the latest advances in phone technology, he took this further with having his team film him with their cell phones whenever he went. This meant these images were streamed live on a website. This generated intense traffic and online chatter. Fans would never know when such moments could happen, so they were forced to check in at regular intervals to try to catch these spontaneous moments, sometimes riveting in their banality, other times made dramatic by 50s flair for confrontation. Membership grew by leaps and bounds. So I want to pause here and just say that is like very forward thinking, like back in the late 2000s, like way before like Facebook and Instagram Live and all of these other platforms where you can go live even happened. So, the fact that he was doing that around that time period was just very forward thinking. And he foresaw in the future where the internet was headed and how people were going to consume content. And I want to also offer another example that I encountered yesterday when I was watching this wrestling video. And, Shane McMahon wanted to stream like one of the ECW matches online, just do it purely online so that it can maintain the edge that ECW is known for. But knowing how Vince McMahon is, he, of course, just wanted to have it his way and stream it on TV, and it was severely watered down. But the fact that those two dudes back then were thinking of streaming it online, like way before it was like a thing, is very forward thinking. And that's what we have to do, and this doesn't only apply to business owners, it applies to every single person in general. Like, you have to be forward thinking in your own life. Like, if you're not in business for yourself, you have to be forward thinking in terms of like finances, the way you raise your kids, the way you do anything, so that you can pretty much be a trailblazer. And so now I'm going to get back to reading. As it evolved, the website came to strangely resemble the world of hustling that he had created himself on the streets of Southside Queens. He could produce testers, trial songs for his fans who were like drug fiends, constantly hungry for new product from 50, and he could get instant feedback on their quality. He could develop a feel for what they were looking for and how he could manipulate their demand. He had moved from the outside to the inside, and the hustling game came alive once more, this time on a global scale. The fearless approach. The public is never wrong. When people don't respond to what you do, they're telling you something loud and clear. You're just not listening. A quote by 50 Cent. All living creatures depend for their survival on their relationship to their environment. If they are particularly sensitive to any kind of change, a danger, or an opportunity, they have a greater power to dominate their surroundings. It is not simply that the hawk can see farther than any other creature, but it can see in great detail, picking out the slightest alteration in the landscape. Its eyes give it tremendous sensitivity to the supreme hunting prowess. We live in an environment that is mostly human. It consists of the people that we interact with day in and day out. These humans come from many varied backgrounds and cultures. They are individuals with their own unique experiences. To know people well, their differences, their nuances, their emotional life, would give us a great sense of connection and power. We would know how to reach them, to communicate more effectively, and influence their actions. But so often we remain on the outside and lack this power. To connect to the environment this way would mean having to move outside of ourselves, train our eyes on people, but so often we prefer to live in our heads amid our own thoughts and dreams. We strive to make everything in the world fair and simple. We grow insensitive to people's differences and the details that make them individuals. At the root of this turning inward and disconnect is a great fear, one of the most primal known to man, and perhaps the least understood. In the beginning, our primitive ancestors formed groups for protection. To create a sense of cohesion, they established all kinds of codes of behaviors, taboos, and shared rituals. They also created myths in which their tribe were considered to be favored by the gods, chosen by some great purpose, for some great purpose. To be a member of a tribe was to be cleansed by the rituals and to be favored by the gods. Those who belonged to other groups had unfamiliar rituals and belief systems, their own gods and origin myths. They were not clean. They represented the other, something dark, threatening, and a challenge to a tribe's sense of superiority. This was part of our psychological makeup for thousands upon thousands of years. It transformed itself into a greater fear of other cultures and ways of thinking. For Christians, this meant all heathens. And despite millennia of civilization, it lies on within us to this day, in a form of a mental process in which we divide the world into what is familiar and unfamiliar, clean and unclean. We develop certain ideas and values. We socialize with those who share those values, who form a part of our inner circle or clique. We form factions of rigid beliefs on the right, on the left, this or that. We live in our heads with the same thoughts and ideas over and over, cocooned from the outside world. When we are confronted with people or individuals who have different ideas and values, we feel threatened. Our first move is to not understand them, but to demonize them, that shadowy other. Alternatively, we may choose to look at them through the prism of our own values and assume that they share them. We mentally convert the other into something familiar. They may come in a completely different culture, but after all, they must want the same things as we do. False. Hell no. Not everybody wants the same thing as you do. And yeah. Anyways, this is a failure of our minds to move onward and understand, to be sensitive to nuance. Everything must be white or black, clean or unclean. Understand, the opposite approach is the way of power in this world. It begins with the fundamental fearlessness. You do not feel afraid or affronted by people who have different ways of thinking or acting. You do not feel superior to those on the outside. In fact, you are excited by such diversity. Your first move is to open up your spirit to these differences, to understand what makes the other tick, to gain a feel for other people's inner lives, how they see the world. In this way, you continually expose yourself to a wider and wider circles of people, building connections to those various networks. The source of your power is your sensitivity and closeness to this social environment. You can detect trends and changes in people's tastes and well before anyone else. In the hood, conditions are more crowded than elsewhere. People with all kinds of different psychologies are constantly in your face. Any power you have depends on your ability to know everything that is going on around you, to be sensitive to changes, aware of the power structures that are imposed on from without and within. There is no room to escape to some inner dreamland. You have a sense of urgency to stay connected to the environment and the people around you. Your life depends on it. We now live in similar conditions. All kinds of people of divergent cultures and psychologies are thrown together. But we live in a society of more apparent abundance and ease. We lack that sense of urgency to connect to other people. This is dangerous. In such a melting pot as the modern world, with people's tastes changing at a faster pace than ever before, our success depends on our ability to move outside of ourselves and connect to other social networks. At all costs, You need to continually force yourself outward. You must reach a point where any sense of losing this connection to your environment translates into a feeling of vulnerability and peril. In the end, this primal fear of ours translates into a mental infirmary, the closing of the mind to any ideas that are new and unfamiliar. And the fearless types in history learn to develop the opposite, an open spirit, a mind that is constantly learning from experience. Look at the example of the great British primatologist Jane Goodall, whose field research revolutionized our ideas of chimpanzees and primates. Prior to Goodall's work, scientists had established certain accepted ideas on how to do research on animals such as chimpanzees. They were mostly to be studied in cages under very controlled circumstances. On occasion, primatologists would research them in the wild. They would come up with various tricks to lure chimpanzees closer to them while remaining hidden behind some kind of protective screen. They would conduct experiments by manipulating the animals and noting their responses. The goal was to come up with general truths about chimpanzee behavior. Only by keeping their distance from the animals could scientists study them. Goodall did not have any formal training on the sciences when she arrived in 1960 in what is known as Tanzania to study chimpanzees in the wild. And if you guys didn't know, Tanzania is a country in Africa. Operating totally on her own, she devised a radically different means of research. The chimps lived in the remotest part of the country and were notoriously shy. She tracked them from a distance, patiently working to gain their trust. She dressed inconspicuously and was careful not to look them in the eye. When she noticed that they were uncomfortable with her being in the area, she moved away or acted like a baboon that was merely digging for insects. Slowly, over the course of several months, she was able to move closer and closer. Now she began to identify the individual chimps that she was seeing. She gave them names, something scientists have never done before. They had always been designated by numbers. With these names, she could begin to detect subtle nuances in their individual behavior, and they had different personalities like humans. After nearly a year of this patient seduction, the chimps began to relax in her presence and allow her to interact with them, something no one had ever achieved before in the history of studying primates in the wild. This took a tremendous degree of courage, as chimpanzees were considered the most volatile of the primates, more dangerous and violent than gorillas. As she interacted with them more and more, she noticed a change in herself as well. I think my mind works like a chimp's subconsciously, she wrote to a friend. She felt this because she had developed an uncanny ability to find them in the forest. Now, gaining access to them, she took note of several phenomena that she believed that belied the accepted data on chimpanzee behavior. Scientists had cataloged the animals as vegetarians. She observed them hunting and eating monkeys. Only humans were considered capable of making and using tools. She saw them crafting elaborate instruments to catch insects for food. She saw them engage in bizarre dance rituals during a rainstorm. She later observed a horrific war that went on for 4 years between rival packs. She cataloged some rather strange Machiavellian behavior among the males who fought for supremacy. All in all, she revealed a degree of variety in their emotional and intellectual lives that altered the concept not only of the chimpanzees but also of primates and mammals. This has great application beyond the realms of science. Normally, when you study something, you begin with certain preconceived notions about the subject. But scientists had to come to believe that the chimpanzees had a limited range of behavior, that all they saw missing the much more complex reality. Your mind begins the process in a closed state, not really sensitive to difference and nuance. You are afraid of having your assumptions challenged. Instead, like Goodall, you must let go of this need to control and narrow your field of vision. When you study an individual or group, your goal is to get inside their minds, their experiences, their way of looking at things. To do this, you must interact with them on a more equal plane. With this open and fearless spirit, you will discover things no one had suspected before. You will have a much deeper appreciation for the targets of your actions or the public you are trying to reach. And with such understanding will come the power to move them. Keys to fearlessness. Few people have the wisdom to prefer the criticism that would do them good to the praise that deceives them. A quote by Francois de la... I ain't gonna even try to pronounce that. So, yeah. Anyways, in a work that we produce for business or for culture, there is always a telling moment when it leaves our hands and reaches the public for which it is intended. In that instant, it ceases to be something that was in our heads. It becomes an object that is to be judged by others. Sometimes this object connects with people in a profound way. It strikes an emotional chord, resonates, and has warmth. It meets a need. Other times it leaves people surprisingly cold. In our minds, we had imagined it having a much different effect. This process can seem rather mysterious. Some people seem to have a knack for creating things that resonate with an audience. They are great artists, politicians with the popular touch, or business people who are endlessly inventive. Sometimes we ourselves produce something that works, but we fail to understand why, and lacking this knowledge, we cannot reproduce the success. There is an aspect of this phenomenon, however, that is explicable. Anything we create or produce for the public, large or small, depending on what we do. If we are the type that lives mostly in our heads, imagining what the intended public will like, or not even caring, this spirit is reproduced in the work itself. It is disconnected from the social environment. It is a product of a person who is wrapped up in him or herself. If, on the other hand, we are deeply connected to the public, if we have a profound sense of their needs and wants, then what we make tends to resonate. We have internalized the way of thinking and feeling of our audience, and it shows in our work. The great Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky had almost two separate parts to his career. In the first, he was a socialist who interacted mostly with other intellectuals. His novels and stories were relatively successful. But then in 1849, he was sentenced to several years of prison and hard labor in Siberia for ostensibly conspiring against the government. There, he suddenly discovered that he had known the Russian people at all. In prison, he was thrown amongst the dregs of society. In the small village where he did his hard labor, he finally mingled with the Russian peasantry that dominated the country. Once he was freed, all of these experiences became deeply embedded in his work. And suddenly his novels resonated far beyond the intellectual circles. He understood his public, the mass of Russian people, from the inside, and his work became immensely popular. Understand, you cannot disguise your attitude towards the public. If you feel superior at all, part of some chosen elite, then this seeps out in the work. It is conveyed in the tone and mood. It feels patronizing. If you have little access to the public you are trying to reach, but you feel your ideas in your head cannot fail to be interesting, then it is inevitably comes across as something too personal, the product of someone who is alienated. In either case, what is really dominating the spirit of your work is fear. To interact closely with the public and get its feedback might mean having to adjust your brilliant ideas, your preconceived notions. This might challenge your tidy vision of the world. You might disguise this with a snobbish veneer, but this is the age-old fear of the other. We are social creatures who make things in order to communicate and connect with those around us. Your goal must be to break down the distance between you and your audience, the base support of your life. Some of this distance is mental. It comes from your ego and a need to feel superior. Some of it is physical. The nature of your business tends to shut you off from the public with layers of bureaucracy. In any event, what you are seeking is maximum interaction, allowing you to get a feel for the people on the inside. You can come to thrive off of their feedback and criticism. Operating this way, what you produce will not fail to resonate because it will come from the inside. This deep-level interaction is the source of the most powerful and popular works in culture and business, and a political style that truly connects. The following are 4 strategies you can use to bring yourself closer to this ideal. So the first strategy is crush all distance. The French artist Henri de I'm not going to try to pronounce that, came from one of the oldest aristocratic bloodlines in France. But from early on, he felt estranged from his family. Part of this came from his physical handicap. His legs had stopped growing at the age of 14, giving him a dwarfish appearance. Part of it came from his sensitive nature. He turned to painting as his only interest in life. And in 1882, at the age of 18, he moved to Paris to study with the famous artist whose studio was in Montmartre, the bohemian and somewhat seedy part of the city. There, he discovered a whole new world. The cafes and dance halls frequented by prostitutes, con artists, dancers, street performers, and all the shady characters who found themselves drawn to his courtier. Perhaps because of his own alienation from his family, he identified with these outcasts. And slowly he began to immerse himself deeper and deeper into the social life of Montmartre. He befriended the prostitutes and hired them as models, seeking to capture the essence of their lives on canvases. He returned to the dance halls and often sketched while he watched. He drank with the criminal types and the anarchist agitators who passed through the neighborhood. He absorbed every aspect of this world, including the habits of the rich people who came to the area for entertainment and to slum it. Other painters like Degas and Renoir, who both live in Montmartre, painted many scenes of life there. But it was always with a sense of distance, as if they were outsiders peeking in. He was more of an active participant, and his drawings and paintings began to reflect this immersion. His work drew more attention from the public. All of this accumulated in the posters that he did for the dance hall in a Moulin Rouge, which he opened in 1889. The first and most famous one of all was the scandalous image of a dancer kicking so high you can see her underwear. The colors were intense and garnished, but the strangest of all is the kind of flat space he created, which gives the viewers the sensation that they are on stage with the performers in the middle of all the activity and the bright lights. No one had created anything quite like it before. When the poster was placed all over the city, people were mesmerized by the image. It seemed to vibrate with the life of its own. And the more and more posters followed of all the figures in the Moulin Rouge whom he came to know on intimate terms. And an entire new aesthetic was forged around this complete democratic mingling with his subjects. His work became immensely popular. Understand, in this day and age, to reach people, you must have access to their inner lives, their frustrations, aspirations, resentments. To do so, you must crush as much distance as possible between you and your audience. You enter their spirit and absorb it from within. Their way of looking at things becomes yours, and when you recreate it in some form of work, it has life. What shocks and excites you will then have the same effect on them. This requires a degree of fearlessness and an open spirit. You are not afraid to have your whole personality shaped by these interactions. You assume a radical equality with the public, giving voice to people's ideas and desires. What you produce will naturally connect in a deep way. The second strategy is to open informal channels of criticism and feedback. When Eleanor Roosevelt entered the White House as the First Lady in 1933, it was with much trepidation. She had a disdain for conventional politics and for the kind of cliquish attitude it had fostered. In her mind, her husband's power would depend on his connection to the people who elected him. To get out of the depression, the public had to feel engaged in the struggle, not merely seduced by speeches and programs. When people feel involved, they bring their own ideas and energy to the cause. Her fear was that the bureaucratic nature of the government would swallow up her husband. He would come to listen to his cabinet members and experts. His contact with the public would be relegated to formal channels such as reports, polls, and studies. This isolation would spell doom, cutting him off from the base of his support. Denied an official position within the administration, she decided to work to create informal channels to the public on her own. She traveled all over the country to inner cities and remote rural towns, listening to people's complaints and needs. She brought many of these back to meet the president and give him firsthand impressions of the effects of the New Deal. She started a column in the Women's Home Companion in which she had posted above the headline, "I want you to write to me." She would use her column as a kind of discussion forum with the American public, encouraging people to share their criticisms. Within 6 months, she had received over 300,000 letters, and with her staff worked to answer every last one of them. She opened other channels of communication, for instance, planting her aides in various New Deal programs who would then poll on the behalf of the public affected by these programs. With the system in place, she began to see a pattern from the bottom up, a growing disenchantment with the New Deal. Every day she left a memo in her husband's basket, reminding him of the criticisms and the need to be more responsive. And slowly she began to have an influence on his policy, pushing him leftward, for instance, getting him to create programs such as the NYA, the National Youth Administration, which would involve young people actively in the New Deal. Over time, she became the unofficial channel of communication for women's groups and African Americans, shoring up FDR's support in these two key constituencies. All of this work took tremendous courage. First, she was continually ridiculed for her activist approach long before any First Lady had ever been thought of taking such a role, and her work played a major part in FDR's ability to maintain his image as a man of the people. As Eleanor understood, any kind of group tends to close itself off from the outside world. It is easier to operate this way. From within this bubble, people would delude themselves into thinking that they have insight into how their audience or public feels. They read the papers, various reports, the poll numbers, etc., While all of this information tends to be flat and highly filtered. It is much different when you interact with the public and hear it in the flesh, their criticisms and feedback. You discover what lies at the root of their discontent, the various nuances of how your work affects them. The problems come to life, and any solutions you come up with have more relevance. You create back and forth dynamic in which their ideas, involvement, and energy can be harnessed for your purposes. If some distance between you and the public must be maintained by the nature of your group or enterprise, then the ideal is to open up as many informal channels as possible, getting your feedback straight from the source. And another strategy is reconnect with your base. We see the following concur over and over. A person has success when they are younger because they have deep ties with the social group. What they produce comes from a real place and connects with the audience. Then they slowly lose this connection. Success creates distance. They come to spend most of their time with successful people. Consciously or unconsciously, they come to feel separated and above their audience. The intensity in their work is gone, and with any kind of real effect on the public. In his own way, the famous black activist Malcolm X struggled with this problem. He had spent much of his youth as a savvy street hustler, ending up in prison on drug charges. There, he discovered the religion of Islam as practiced by the Nation of Islam and immediately converted. Out of prison, he became a visible spokesperson for the group. Eventually, he broke off from the Nation of Islam and transformed himself into a leading figure in a growing black power movement of the 1960s. In these various phases of life, Malcolm felt intense anger and frustration at the levels of injustice for African Americans, much of which he had experienced firsthand. He channeled these emotions into powerful speeches, seeming to give them voice to anger that many felt who lived deep within the ghettos of America. But as he became more and more famous, he felt some anxiety. Other leaders in a black community that he had known began to live fairly well. They could not help but to feel some distance and superiority for those who they were supposed to represent, like a father caring for a child. Malcolm hated that feeling of creeping paternalism. In his mind, people could only help themselves. His role was to inspire them to action, not to act in their name. To inoculate himself against the psychic distance, he increased his interactions with street hustlers and agitators, the kind of people who, from the lower depths, that the most leaders would scrupulously avoid. Those from the heart of the ghetto were his power base, and he had to reconnect to them. He made himself spend more time with those who had suffered recent injustices, soaking up their experiences and sense of outrage. Most people mellow with age. He would retain his anger, the intensity of emotions that have impelled him in the first place and given him his charisma. The goal in reconnecting to the public is not to please everyone or to spread yourself out to the widest possible audience. Communication is power of intensity, not extensity in numbers. In trying to widen your appeal, you will substitute quantity for quality, and you will pay a price. You have a base of power, a group of people, small or large, which identifies with you. This base is also mental, the ideas you had when you were younger, which tied you to powerful emotions and inspired you to take a particular path. Time and success tend to diffuse the sense of connection you have to this physical and mental base. You will drift and your powers of communication will diminish. Know your base and work to reconnect with it. Keep your associations with it alive, intense, and present. Return to your origins, the source of all inspiration and power. And then the last strategy, I believe, is create the social mirror. Alone in our minds, we can imagine we have all kinds of powers and abilities. Our egos can inflate to any size. But when we produce something that fails to have expected impact, we are suddenly faced with a limit. We are not as brilliant or skilled as we had imagined. In such case, our tendency is to blame others for not understanding it or getting in our way. Our egos are bruised and delicate. Criticism from the outside seems like a personal attack, which we cannot endure. We tend to close ourselves off, and this makes it doubly difficult to succeed with our next venture. Instead of turning inward, consider people's coolness to your idea and their criticisms as a kind of mirror they are holding up to you. A physical mirror turns you into an object. You can see yourself as others see you. Your ego cannot protect you. The mirror does not lie. You use it to correct your appearance and avoid ridicule. The opinions of other people serve a similar function. Your view of your work from the inside your mind, encrusted with all kinds of desires and fears. They see it as an object. They see it as it is. Through their criticisms, you can get closer to this objective version and gradually improve what you do. One caveat, beware of feedback from friends whose judgments could be tainted by feelings of envy and the need to flatter. When your work does not communicate with others, consider it your own fault. You did not make your ideas clear enough and you failed to connect with your audience emotionally. This will spare you any bitterness or anger that might come from people's critiques. You are simply perfecting your work through the social mirror. Reversal of perspective. Science and the scientific method are very powerful and practical pursuits of knowledge that have come to dominate much of our thinking for the past few centuries. But they have also spawned a peculiar preconception. That is, to understand anything, we must study it from a distance with a detached perspective. We tend to judge a book that is full of statistics and quotes from various studies as carrying more weight because it seems to have the prerequisite scientific objectivity and distance. Science, however, often deals with the manner that is inorganic or has a marginal emotional life. Studying such things from a detached perspective makes sense and yields profound results, but this does not translate so well when dealing with people and creatures who respond from an emotional core. The knowledge of what makes them tick on the inside is missing. To study them from the outside is merely a prejudice, often stemming from fear, dealing with people's experiences and subjectivity is messy and chaotic. Distance is cleaner and easier. It is time to reevaluate this preconception and see things from the opposite perspective. Knowledge of human nature and social factors, the kind that is most often valuable to us, depends on knowing people and the networks from the inside, on getting a feel for what they are expecting. This can best be gained by an intense involvement and participation as opposed to the pseudo-scientific pose of the intellectual addicted to studies, citations, and numbers designed to back up their preconceptions. This other form of knowledge from the inside must be one that you can esteem from above all the social matters. It is what will give you power to affect people. To the extent that you feel yourself to be distant and on the outside, you must tell yourself that you do not understand what you are studying or trying to reach. You are missing the mark and there is work to be done. Here is a quote from Baron de Montesquieu. A really intelligent man feels for what men only know. So, that pretty much concludes the 7th chapter of the 50th Law book. And if you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and ask them right now. And if you guys had learned anything from the chapter that I just read to you just now, you can go ahead and jot down your thoughts as well in the comment section. And I seen that 3 people just hopped on. Like we have Maria, Heather, R, and Karen Smith. And then we have, Heather, Maria, and Karen. And Jeff hopped on. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And Angelica. I'm going to go ahead and wave at you. So, I apologize if I didn't get to your guys' comments in time. I'm just going ahead and just, reading a book because it is a lot to read, but at the same time, it's fun. And Heather asked me, are you missing being in the car? Good morning, good afternoon. Well, honestly, since I live with my folks right now, I don't want to have a whole bunch of noise going on in the background. And you guys just hearing all of that. So the reason that I come and record in the car on certain days is because, it's much more isolated. The noise is contained and, I'm able to focus more on what I am doing as opposed to being in a house where there's loads of distractions. I'm able to focus in the car because there's not really much to distract me from what I'm doing. So I do it for those purposes. In case you guys are wondering, why I'm always recording in the car most days. And so Karen says, hi, love from the UK. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Shouts out to the UK. And Ibrahim says, because we are afraid to connect with ourselves, intimacy equals into me, I see. Big facts, big facts, big facts. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and pin that comment right now. So how can I go ahead and do so? I'm trying to go ahead and pin it, while I'm up here. So I'm going to pin it for everybody to see. Ibrahim, I'm going to show you some love, man. You just said something that's very profound, and that is big facts. And I'm going to tell you why. The reason why that we are afraid to connect with ourselves is because, of us growing up in a certain family dynamic. For instance, you've had certain aspects of yourself that you told that was bad or not good. And so because of that programming, you were afraid to connect and go within yourself. And because you're afraid to go within yourself, it spills outwardly in your day-to-day social interactions to where, you avoid people at all costs and you're afraid of diving deep with them because you haven't dove deep within yourself. And this is why it says that, before you can connect with anybody else, you have to connect with yourself. And there's also another saying that goes, you can only meet people as deeply as they met themselves. And because your parents didn't dive deep within themselves and because they didn't love themselves like they could have, they started passing on that dysfunction and that pain and that sorrow and resentment on you and projecting their own insecurities upon you, making you feel inferior. And so in turn, you tend to view people who have those exact aspects within you inferior as well, because you haven't yet accepted and loved those parts of yourself. And so what it all boils down to, what this book is about, and I have like 2 more chapters to go because there's 10 chapters total, is learning how to love yourself as well. So I get that from this book as well. I don't know if you guys are getting that as well, if you guys have been keeping up with the book, the readings that I've done from chapters 1 all the way up until this point. But basically, like, this book is about self-reliance, and I do get, a hint of self-love from this book as well. Like I said, I don't know if you guys get that same energy like I do, but that's just like my personal thoughts. But yeah, basically that chapter in a nutshell, if I were to sum it up, would basically just be about just getting out of your own head and getting over that fear of connecting with other people, and just like getting outside of your comfort zone and really interacting with the people in your environment. Obviously, we can't interact physically right now because of the whole social distancing, and this whole coronavirus pandemic is keeping most people indoors, but we can collect electronically. You know what I'm saying? And Heather asked me, do you think 50 is more controversial these days? Oh yeah, absolutely. Abso-freaking-lutely. Like, if you follow 50 Cent on Instagram, you would know that 50 just, oh my God. He just does the most off the wall, out the box stuff. Like, he just says the craziest things. Like, I would just go on his Instagram and he would just like straight up just clown people. Like, that's what he mostly does nowadays, is that he just clowns people. He's like an internet comedian now, if I were to sum it up. You know what I'm saying? And I honestly think that he could have had a side career as a comedian, but, at the time he was just focusing on music, and now he's just focusing on movies and television. But yeah, 50 is without a shadow of a doubt, is controversial. It's controversial still. He may not be like, doing these like things that I spoke about in his book, where he would just smash a flat screen TV on the floor, but he's just doing things, for laughs and stuff. So that's what I've noticed personally. But yeah, I'll definitely say so. And also another thing that, I got from the chapter was, it was reflecting to me my own fears and insecurities about connecting with other people because of the family dynamic I grew up in. Because, me coming from like the millennial generation, or as they call us, Zoomers, I don't remember which one it is because I was born in 98. Our generation was the first generation to grow up off of computers and game systems and be surrounded by all of these electronics. So we spent most of our time indoors and just like playing the game and watching TV and, doing all this stuff, but not really connecting with ourselves and our environment like we could have been. And, me seeing as how much I've been sheltered throughout my whole childhood, and, growing up in a family that's telling you like, oh no, don't go there. The snake, you might get bit by a snake. Don't go here. Don't go there. And because, I was constantly surrounded by that energy, that fearful attitude towards the outside world was reinforced inside of my own mind. And slowly but surely, I was putting in that work to overcome that dynamic. For instance, like back in high school, I remember my junior year, I was purposely putting myself in harm's way by acting more bolder than ever just to overcome those fears. Like, with my family telling me, don't go walking outside at night because the police gonna harass you and catch you. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and test that. So on purpose, I would just leave the house and I would just walk around outside all night into different neighborhoods within the neighborhood that I lived in. And I've done that every single day just to overcome that fear. And because I did so, I found that, there was really nothing to be scared of. Like, I've never been harassed by the police. I've never suffered racism. I never experienced any of that. And so what I'm really trying to say here is you have to overcome your fears by facing them head on. And just to expand upon that, or what I just said just now, more often than not, people were waving to me and being friendly to me and saying, hello, how was your day, sir? How are you feeling? And I know it's something that's really small, but it was something that really helped me have a paradigm shift and helped me change my perception about the world. And that let me know in that moment that all of these fears that I had was pre-programmed and implanted inside of me. Now, I'm not saying that, every single person is safe to be around and that I'm just going to randomly just befriend everybody and just go in people's houses. Like, I'm not saying that. You obviously want to guard yourself from toxic people because there are people with bad energy. But at the same time, you don't want to be so fearful that you start missing out on building wonderful relationships with people.